Caller calling from a 303 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hey, my name is Matt, calling from Longmont, Colorado.
Matt, what's on your mind?
I officially left the Republican Party in 2015 and have since become a progressive. So I still have some friends with opposing views to my own. I was talking with a right-wing conservative friend of mine about immigration and the camps the other day, and he said, those kids are in cages until they can be sent home. So I asked, when are they going to be sent home? Why have they already sent some of the parents home without them? And ultimately, if Obama was able to deport record numbers of people during his administration, then why don't we just use the exact same methods and deport these folks instead of separating families and stockpiling them in these overcrowded cells and cages? It ended up being one of those rare moments where I managed to stump this guy, but I'm curious, what do you guys think about that? If they aren't going to grant amnesty or a pathway to citizenship, then why not at least deport them immediately? Or am I just oversimplifying it?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, you're oversimplifying it insofar as like you need to process these people. You need to give them. You can't just deport them right off. And the problem is that the Trump administration put out the word that they were going to close the borders. And so people are trying to get in under the wire. It used to be the case that you would allow these families to stay together and then stay with other friends or family who would come, and they would be able to keep track of where they were. And about 80 to 95% of these people would come back for their hearings in an orderly fashion. From a logistics standpoint, I'm not 100% sure why the Trump administration couldn't do what the Obama administration does, but they don't want to, because they actually are using this as a policy to deter people from coming, and it's clearly not working. But let me ask you a question: What was it that in 2015 that made you turn from a Republican to a progressive?
The candidates. Oh, well, so I say officially because I had been, I voted for Obama twice. Before that, I voted for George W. Bush, and I always regretted that. I didn't see the light at the time I have now. And when I was looking at those candidates in 2016 for the Republican Party, especially Donald Trump, I was appalled. And I had my doubts and frustrations with the Democratic Party, but I thought that they were still a fighting chance over there. So I switched sides. I'm technically a Democrat, but I call myself a progressive because I can't really relate to those folks 100%.
Right. Interesting. Well, I appreciate the call. I'll try and get an answer for you on that, on exactly if the Trump administration could do what Obama did, and if they don't, why?
Yeah, because otherwise it just feels like a political stunt. Like they're just doing it so that they can, like you said, deter people from coming over here, but, at what cost?
Well, I think that's what they're doing, and I don't think they care about the cost, but I appreciate the call.
Okay, thank you.
Let's go to a 509 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hey, Sam, this is Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan, just the man I wanted to speak to.
Oh, cool.
Did you hear that last caller?
Yeah.
Well,
okay.
What is it? What is it? Why is it the Trump? Why is there this problem at the border? I mean, was my assessment of it correct? Why couldn't Trump deport? I'm not saying he should. I would actually argue he should not. But why couldn't he deport at the rate that Obama did, particularly in his first term?
Well, I think that they probably tried. I'm not sure exactly why the numbers weren't quite up to snuff. Obama's numbers were really from the overuse or the expanded use of a process called expedited removal at the border, where if people are detained within a certain distance of a port of entry, they can be expeditiously removed, and that can count as a deportation. Whereas in the past, a lot of those people were returned under what's called voluntary return. So basically, they take their picture, they sign a form, and then they return them without any legal consequence. So under certain circumstances, Border Patrol can just expeditiously order somebody deported without a judge or anything. Now, if more people are requesting asylum and saying, I'm afraid to go back, then that means they can't just immediately be deported. They have to have an interview with an asylum officer. There's a whole process. But, I think what is going on now is that under the Obama administration, people were fairly aggressively paroled. They're allowed to come in, and Border Patrol would put them in removal proceedings where they would, get the chance to go before a judge and present an asylum claim. And in some cases, you would even see people who didn't express a fear. They were apprehended at the border, and Border Patrol paroled them and placed them in removal proceedings. And, I would talk to these people, and they'd say, well, I just came here to work. I'm not afraid to go back, but now I have a deportation hearing. And I think in some cases, Border Patrol was doing that as a sort of release valve, because maybe they didn't have capacity for somebody, or it was the middle of the night, and it was their shift was almost over. Or it was
prosecutorial discretion is basically what it comes down to.
Right, and they they were telling the officer, look, my brother lives in Yakima, and they called the brother, and the brother said, yeah, I'm here. And so rather than detain them and whatever, they would just parole them sometimes. So, but I mean, basically what's happening is, quite explicitly, I think, it's not like we're reading a lot into this, is they're trying to act as a deterrent. And the only way you can really do that when people are fleeing from abhorrent gang violence and complete chaos is to out cartel the cartels. And so you have to be, if you wake up in the morning and there's heads on your front porch, or your neighbor's house is on fire and their bodies are strung up on the overpass or whatever, you're going to flee. And the only way you'd be deterred from fleeing is if what's on the other side is even worse.
Right.
And so this is sort of the only way we're going to be successful is if the images coming out and the stories coming out are even more brutal and more disgusting and more violent than what people have to face if they stay. So, yeah, I mean, it's on the one hand complicated, on the other hand not that complicated. We could just not torture. These conditions are terrible, and it's expensive. You could just put them in a Holiday Inn, or a lot of the people being detained have families that they could easily be released to. There's all kinds of alternatives to detention, including things that I'm not a fan of, like ankle monitoring and regular check-ins, and at the local ICE offices, which is what people have been doing really since 2014 or even earlier. And it's been successful. But this goes back to even earlier when Jeff Sessions issued this decision, matter of AB, where he said, well, domestic violence or gang violence is not a grounds for protection under our asylum laws. And so they started even before all of this by trying to cut off the legal mechanisms that people could use to get protection. And it's not like everyone who was a victim of a gang or domestic violence was being granted asylum anyways. It was already really hard, even if you'd been battered or whatever the circumstances. But, this is just purely about not wanting brown people here. I think one of the ironies or the tragedies, I don't know, this is like American history 101, but At the same time, we've got these people in cages. I'm in an agricultural district, and our congressman is trying to get an expansion of the guest worker program because we have like a major labor shortage.
Yep.
And so we have people in cages who want to do jobs and jobs that need doing. And, these things can't connect somehow.
Somebody was telling me on the Cape, up in Massachusetts, a lot of these Cape towns, and I imagine this is probably happening in the coast of Maine. I imagine it's happening at all these sort of like summer destinations. There was a lot of Eastern Europeans who used to work there. I mean, years ago, it used to be Irish, but a lot of Eastern Europeans, and they can no longer get visas. So on some level, that's at least slightly encouraging insofar as that they're being, they're not just reserving their ire just for brown people, but they're making it much more difficult for immigrants, to come even just in seasonal work. It's pretty stunning.
Yeah. And the guy who I guess he's the acting director of USCIS, which is the sort of legal, family-based or affirmative types of immigration relief. So if you're applying for your wife or whatever, he's in charge of this part of immigration. And he's going on, the crazy thing is he's going on Fox News and acting as a mouthpiece for ICE and talking about deporting people and all this stuff when this is a part of the agency, which has always very traditionally been about, we're here to sort of help people actually get their papers. And, not that they're super helpful, but the people that they put in charge of this agency are also like deportation hawks, which means if you are filing for your wife or your parent or something, and you've got all your ducks in a row, instead of having like a fairly, friendly adjudicator who's there to sort of make sure everything's in order, they're now ratcheting things up and really looking for reasons to deny applications or to ask for more evidence, and everything is sort of grinding to a slow halt. So everything is terrible. I wanted to real quick talk about that Seattle case of the chief counsel guy who was stealing immigrants' identities. That story kind of starts a few years earlier when one of their trial attorneys, Jonathan Love, got convicted for forging documents in a case from 7 years earlier. And he forged this document which basically blocked somebody in removal proceedings from qualifying for relief to stay in the country. And so the guy was deported. And luckily the case was reviewed by another attorney who realized this form that was supposedly signed by the respondent, the immigrant, is an ICE form that predates ICE. Like, this form can't have existed. And it was filed in court by this trial attorney, Jonathan Love. And his boss was this chief counsel, Rafael Sanchez, who was just convicted sentenced to 4 years. And at the time, advocates were saying, hey, there should really be like an audit of this guy's cases, because what are the odds that in this one case 7 years ago, he forged this document? And it was a really run-of-the-mill case. It wasn't like he was trying to, not that there would ever be an excuse to forge a document, but it wasn't somebody who he felt like had gotten away with a rape or something like that. It was just a regular guy who he wanted deported. And the chief counsel, Rafael Sanchez, his boss, was like, no, everything's fine. This was a one-time thing. And then a couple years later, it comes out that Rafael Sanchez, it wasn't just like, I'm going to use a couple social security numbers of immigrants in removal proceedings. He was like fabricating IDs, using their photos off their green cards, and making a fake Washington state driver's licenses, checking their credit scores. So he's going through these people in removal proceedings and trying to decide like where to exercise prosecutorial discretion, and like on the side checking their credit score to see, you know, what kind of credit card he could get in their name.
Oh my God.
And so one of my friends, a colleague, he's a big FOIA guy, and he's tried to FOIA all the communication between, you know, these two individuals or, you know, other members of that office, and he's been totally stonewalled, of course. And so, you know, there's just no accountability, and it's a rotten agency for sure.
And now, on top of all that, the Justice Department is now instructing the immigration judges that they will now be doing this from like remotely with videos and no interpreters, which that should make things run pretty smoothly, right? Do you have any questions? I don't follow your question. Thank you for coming.
Right. So there's these, you know, preliminary hearings where you go and you sort of give them, you know, advisories and you take applications and things like that. And apparently they want to just have like a video recording of somebody saying, you're in removal proceedings and here are your rights, but not have interpreters there so that the respondent can actually communicate with the court, which is, you know, if you're represented, if you're able to come up with the money to hire a lawyer or you're being represented pro bono, you should have a lawyer who's able to communicate with you. But a lot of people can't afford it. And so the immigration judge essentially has to act as, you know, as an advocate in some ways of the respondent, and by informing them of things, asking them certain questions, making sure they've, you know, screened them for potential relief and that sort of thing. And when you take the interpreter out of the equation, you know, we're just at a point, we're one step away from like, let's just not even have a court. So, yeah, it's pretty crazy. But, you know, this is, it's been going on for a while, and it's good that people are paying attention, and hopefully we can start to hear some actual like proposals and solutions from these candidates who are running. So, yeah, thanks for taking my call.
Appreciate the call.